Firstly, what we've done is establish the state as the lead on any defence matters in Western Australia. So prior to our coming to office, there was no designated minister or clear leadership provided to the sector by the state government. We now have a minister, we have a portfolio of defence issues, and my office leads government discussion around defence matters. We established a Defence West office to provide the bureaucratic and public sector response to coordinating support of defence industry in Western Australia, advising government and ensuring that we know about opportunities that might present for our state's industries. And I think people have seen that we've appointed a defence advocate, former retired Rear Admiral Roden Gates, to be out there and making the case in Canberra, essentially, mostly, to be our eyes, ears and voice in Canberra on behalf of the Western Australian state government and on any defence matters, but also on behalf of the defence industry in Western Australia. Those are key responses. We also have other activities underway where we're developing a much more comprehensive defence industry strategy, which will be being concluded and presented early in the next year, probably by about midway through next year. But in the meantime, we're pursuing, on behalf of defence industry in Western Australia, a lot of opportunities on a daily basis. I went over with a small team to Pacific this year to witness what happened there and engage in some discussions with people about what we might do to establish our own form of a defence expo or conference. We've determined that what we'll do is probably start off a little smaller, but more focused on a conference with an attached expo. The main objective will be to establish a very high quality conference as the basis for an opportunity for some of our defence industry players to exhibit their wares and showcase themselves to a wide audience, an international audience, but particularly an Indian Ocean focused audience. So the first thing we'll be doing is getting our first ever event up near the end of next year. The specific dates yet to be determined, but as soon as we have that, we'll be promulgating it. We'll be seeking to make the subject matter something that is of great interest to as wider an audience as possible, but particularly focused on Indian Ocean matters. And we'll draw in world-class speakers with a view to attracting people to participate from right around the Indian Ocean region, but beyond. And as I say, we'll attach an expo of local players to that conference to enable them to showcase themselves. I think it's an opportunity. I mean, clearly there's a very Pacific focused event. I know people on the East Coast like to think that throwing Indo in front of Pacific covers things and they therefore claim that they're talking about both regions. But I think undeniably Western Australia is the nation's key player in the Indian Ocean region. We're deeply engaged right around the Indian Ocean rim on a commercial basis. Many of our industries players are right throughout Africa. We're in the subcontinent, we're into Asia. 25%, a quarter of Australia's trade with ASEAN is done from Western Australia. We are the source of the main exports from this nation with China, with Japan, with South Korea, not just in iron ore and gas, but also in a lot of our agricultural products. So it makes a lot of sense that we should be therefore also able to engage in the defence sector quite easily by exploiting or leveraging off those relationships. The AMC, the Common User Facility and the wider AMC and the concentration of industrial players that reside in that area, but also are further afield in the greater metropolitan Perth region, represent a key support to our defence efforts. They obviously sustain and maintain the Navy a lot in many ways, but they also provide a lot of capability to Army and Air Force, and they are supportive of operations. But what they also represent is, and what that region, what the industrial park and the AMC and the common user facility represent, is a safe haven for our players, but also our allies from any operations right throughout the Indian Ocean and beyond. We are the safe haven in this region. We have high technological capability. Our industry players are innovative and adaptive, and they're responsive. They're very quick because they've had to develop capabilities in the very demanding world of offshore oil and gas and mining, where failure isn't tolerated, and you have to be rapid in your response to demands of the customer. And so they apply that same skill set, that same capability to supporting defence, as do our universities and our researchers. So they too have developed their capabilities in the crucible of the commodity sector, which is a very demanding environment. So they were able to apply all of that via the AMC to support particularly maritime naval operations, but also other defence capabilities in the region. My view of infrastructure, defence infrastructure in Western Australia, is the state's given a fair amount already. If you consider what successive governments, not just the former Labor government, but also subsequently and before, successive Western Australian state governments have contributed well in excess of a fair share from a state government to the defence effort in the form of infrastructure contributions. It's time the federal government contributed to Western Australia in a little, but also in the national interest, contributed to infrastructure in this state on a greater level, in my view. We've just witnessed $500 million funded by the federal government in South Australia to enhancing their infrastructure to support defence activities. It would be appropriate, in my view, that some significant expenditure is undertaken in Western Australia for the same outcome in the national interest. The floating dock is one of many potential investments that the federal government could undertake in Western Australia for defence. I think they should be considering right now. We've had the offshore patrol vessel decision made public. Right now, they must rapidly move to invest in the infrastructure to support construction of our 10 hulls of the offshore patrol vessel project in Western Australia. That needs to be done in advance of the hulls being built here, so they should be getting on with refining and defining exactly what's going to be spent, what infrastructure is required. They should work with CIVMEC, Forjax and Austal and ourselves. The state government are players because the infrastructure is ours, the land is ours, and they need to talk to us about that. That needs to be resolved quickly. Beyond that, I think there's a need to consider future demands or requirements for defence in Western Australia. They should be considering, for instance, dualling of the channel into Coburn Sound to ensure that we have some redundancy, we're not so reliant upon one channel and it's not a key vulnerability. That'll be required for the state's purposes for expanding the outer harbour anyway, but in the national interest for defence it'll be required. So why not bring forward some expenditure and get that done, create some jobs in WA when we need it right now, and get that capability built. We have argued that the federal government should consider a graving dock on this coast. Really, it's a critical vulnerability that if you have a large vessel and you need to dock, you have to go all the way around the other side of the country, or you have to rely on a foreign country to do it in our region. It's not essential. I'm sure if you asked Navy players now, that wouldn't necessarily be their number one priority, but in the event that infrastructure money is going to be spent, it doesn't have to be defence infrastructure money. In the event that infrastructure money is going to be expended in Western Australia, that is consideration should be given to creating a graving dock capability on this coast. That's another thing. More wharfage at the AMC or at the common user facility to facilitate not just construction or support or fitting out of ships as part of the recent announcements, but also to support maintenance and sustainment of the fleet in Western Australia would be something that could be considered. Again, I wouldn't presume to suggest what Defence will want, but these are things that could be considered by the federal government. All of them should be considered, and they should seek advice from Defence as to what their priorities are. But in the event that the federal government's looking to balance the ledger a little over the appalling GST share that Western Australia receives, they might consider spending infrastructure money in Western Australia. It doesn't have to be defence money, but certainly infrastructure could be created, creates jobs while they're building it, also creates capability to support naval and defence operations in Western Australia in the future.